It's my great pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Tim Rhodes. Tim is a professor in public health sociology at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine at the University of London. He is also honorary professor of public health sociology at the University of New South Wales. Dr. Rhodes directs the Center for Research on Drugs and Health Behavior in the UK, and he is editor-in-chief of the International Journal of Drug Policy, and this is a widely acclaimed journal in the area of harm reduction. Tim is a very accomplished social science researcher with an extensive publication list, and his publications have been widely cited and read. He is a very strong proponent of research that examines the social contexts that influence health behaviors, and in particular drug use and harms associated with drug use. His work emphasizes the interplay between one's environment and health, including the role of political, economic factors in shaping health. He argues that HIV prevention is unavoidably political in that it calls for community action and structural changes in order to ensure equity in health and human rights. We're thrilled to have Tim with us today, and he's going to talk about living the risk environment, case studies in qualitative research on HIV and drugs. And the format for this afternoon is Tim is going to speak for about 30 to 40 minutes, and then we'll open it up to the floor for questions and discussion. So please help me in welcoming Tim today.
Thank you very much, Lois. That's much appreciated. And thank you all, too, for being here. And thanks to the three co-sponsors as well for enabling my trip to Halifax. First time I've been here, and I'm having a great time, and I am liking the weather. So the topic today is living the risk environment, and I'm going to be drawing on three case studies in qualitative research. So there's a little bit of methods in my talk, and there's a little bit of findings as well, and hopefully somewhere an argument as well. As Lois says, much of my work has involved, if you like, unpacking the social environments in which people live, to try and explore how they interplay with those environments, to try and understand how those environments shape their capacity for risk reduction and health maximization, if you like. And I've been doing that largely in the context of injecting drug use and HIV. So I'm going to tell three short stories which relate to three qualitative studies that I've been doing over the years, actually. They're not all very recent ones, which in different ways help us unpack the risk environment in relation to HIV. But when we say risk environment, I don't only mean in relation to HIV specifically. I'd also like to think about the risk environment in a broader sense, as an environment in which disruption can occur, or where things are uncertain and or insecure. So not only in relation to HIV, but a risk environment in relation to uncertainty more broadly. That might come clearer as we proceed. All right, so I'm going to tell three short stories. That's how I'd like us to see them. The first story will take us back to the mid-1990s in London. And this is a time before antiretroviral treatments were widely available for the treatment of HIV. And this is a qualitative study of mine which tried to understand how people living with HIV and their sexual partners risk manage, if you like, their sexual safety and relationships in this context of uncertainty. The second short story jumps a little further forward, and it takes us to Serbia in the southeast of Europe. And this story, again, it's a qualitative study. It was undertaken between 2004 and 2006, almost 10 years after the global introduction of antiretroviral treatment. And this study describes how people living with HIV experience their HIV treatment in a context of very insecure and fragile treatment provision. And it tries to understand how individuals navigate that uncertainty in relation to their HIV treatment. The third story takes us to Russia, again around the mid-90s, and specifically to the cities of Moscow, Volgograd, and Barnaul in Western Siberia, where we were doing a whole bunch of studies, but these draw again on some qualitative depth interviews with injecting drug users. And this case study is a little different. It explores how the risk environment, specifically in relation to policing practices and law enforcement practices, shape, well, or in fact constrain these drug injectors' capacity for risk reduction. So those are our three short stories that we're going to tell now. First of all, though, I'm just going to give us a quick reminder on what we might mean by risk environment. And obviously, we can define this concept in many, many different ways. But the simplest way to think about it, I think, is anything which is beyond the individual. So this is kind of extra individual factors, stuff which is out there, beyond the individual and his or her kind of biological or cognitive condition, stuff out there which interplays with the individual and shapes how they think, how they behave, and their kind of risk-related practices in relation to HIV. So this is one kind of way of, if you like, providing a heuristic on what the risk environment might look like. And some of my work has tried to kind of describe this. And it's very simple. It's overly simple, obviously. And I think that's the first thing to say. It's not a pathways model. It doesn't unpack all the kind of interplay and relationships between different levels of environment and different types of environment. Rather, it just provides us a way to see or to think about some of the analytical building blocks which we think might be relevant for understanding how the HIV risk environment might be researched or might inform how we intervene. So on this side, we've got different types or forms of environment, from the physical environment through to the social environment, the economic environment, and policy environment. And on the top, we've got different levels of environmental influence, from the macro to the micro. So an injecting site, a public injecting site, such as a shooting gallery, for instance, might be considered an example of a micro-physical environment, just for instance. But I think it's important to note at the outset that all these things are a bit of a melting pot. So if you take something like gender, for instance, this is operating both at a macro level as it is at a micro-social interactional level. Policies also operate at the macro level, but obviously influence how programs, how communities, how institutions behave. So all these things are interplaying across different forms of environment and across different levels at the same time. The other additional thing I'd say at the outset is we've got to be very sure to remind ourselves that this is all happening in time. This is a reciprocal relationship. The way individuals act and respond in relation to their environments, in turn, has an impact on those social relations and environments. So it's an ongoing reciprocal relationship between how agencies interact with environments, what might be described as a process of structuration. This figure, incidentally, I should credit it, is from a paper by Stephanie Strathedy published last year in The Lancet, which was looking at the injecting drug use risk environment. So that's just a kind of reminder, if you like, of how we might see the risk environment. What I'm going to do today is slightly different. As I said, I want to draw on three qualitative short stories which help capture how the environment might influence HIV risk perception and practices and or engagement with HIV treatment. Now, we all know from the outset that the main role of qualitative research, if you like, is to capture things from the perspectives of participants themselves. And in so doing, unpack or describe the social meanings which those individuals attach to their practices and how those social meanings are in turn modified by particular social contexts or environments. I mean, that's what qualitative research does. And by doing so, it captures how risk is a socially situated product, of the context in which it occurs. But the argument I want to make today, which is in part a methodological one, but I think maybe goes beyond that, is to remind ourselves that qualitative research itself has a social context. We all understand the important role of qualitative research, as I said, in capturing the world from people's perspectives. But today, I want to remind us that qualitative research and the interviews that people provide also take place within a social context. So all accounts themselves have a context. personal stories are told against a backdrop of normative expectations, or cultural scripts, if you like, in relation to what it may be taken for granted or is seen as socially acceptable. And I think that's especially important when we're talking to people who in some way are commonly perceived to be deviating from the norm. For instance, when marginalized by illness or knowingly doing dangerous or risky things, which might fly in the face of normative expectation. So a key message of today is a story is never neutral. It's always inevitably a mix of the real and the representation. And when people are doing qualitative interviews, interviewees, they take into account the social situation in which that interview is taking place and who the other person is and how they perceive, what they perceive or expect to be kind of normative in terms of you know, the area of discussion. So a mix of the real and the representation. But in addition, qualitative interviews and all narratives do more than that, I think, and this is what I want us to follow through this talk if we can. They narrate a self. People are portraying to us experience of theirs at the same time as using narrative as making sense of that experience. And this is what narratives do. So in the time of risk and risk environment, I think what we're arguing today is that qualitative accounts not only help us capture how that risk is socially situated, helping us to grasp what that lived experience is like, but these narratives are also ways of coping, ways of living through risk for those individuals themselves, no matter how they present it to us as researchers. So there's two plots of this talk. So accounts about risk generate narratives to deal with that risk. That's basically the argument of today. So as Arthur Frank reminds us, who's a narrative kind of analysis kind of person, stories have to repair the damage that illness has done to the ill person's sense of where she is in life and where she may be going. Stories are a way of drawing maps and finding new destinations. He also says the way out of a narrative wreckage, for instance, when major disruption in one's life has happened, is telling stories. To a large extent, people talk their way out of trouble. That's in part how they make sense of this self-disruption and form or create a new biographical destination, a recovered self, if you like, a repaired self. So, the first case study. Lois, you should keep me abreast of what time it is, because I'll have no idea, I'm afraid. So should we start with the first case study, which, as I said, takes us to London before the time of antiretroviral treatment. And this was a study, incidentally, which I used for my PhD. And the main story here is intimacy as a solution to risk. And by risk, as I said earlier, we're not just thinking in terms of viral risk, we're also thinking in terms of insecurity or uncertainty more broadly. So myself and a woman, Linda Cusick, we interviewed 73 people, 61 of whom were living with HIV and 12 of whom were negative partners of those people with HIV. So we had 8 couples. Over half of the people we interviewed talked about having unprotected sex in their sexual relationships. And we were commissioned, basically, by our UK Department of Health to help answer the question, why, when people know this is a high-risk situation, are people having unprotected sex? So we were commissioned to find out how this risk is socially situated as a rational thing to do, given the social conditions and the circumstances. You have to remember at the time, back in the mid-90s, and maybe a little bit now, depending, the focus of HIV prevention was very individually orientated. It was kind of a means and knowledge approach to health promotion. You know, once risk aware, you are in a position to make sensible and rational choices, to do, you know, the responsible thing. You're an autonomous citizen, and you practice safer sex. So we wanted to account for how people saw unprotected sex as rational, given their circumstances, rather than as a dysfunctional or strange thing to do. Now, the overarming theme was intimacy, but first of all, I want to say something about the context of the study. At the time, I think it's fair to say that the social context around HIV was dominated by uncertainty. HIV was said to be different at the time from other life-threatening diseases because of the uncertainty which exists around it. The unpredictable nature of it makes the future very uncertain.